Hello, my name is Joel Morin. I am a student of The Ohio State University, majoring in Human Development and Family Sciences, in the hopes of using the skills and knowledge I gain here as an educator. I believe one of the most important things we can do as adults is to spark that curiosity and drive that is essential in our children's education. This podcast is a small contribution to that spark, and I hope you find it helpful. Ultimately, what I will present here will contribute to a final project which I am submitting for a class named ESPHE 3206, Schools and Society. For this project, I have chosen to talk broadly about two things majorly impacting education in America today: race and ethnicity, and further, poverty. Now, I would first like to point out that these topics are massive and so important that I cannot possibly do them justice in the short time that I have here. So I would highly recommend you read the description of this video, which contains links to research and literature related to these subjects. In the description, there is also a survey, which I sent to two old high school counselors of mine, Dr. Cherie Thigpen and Mrs. Lee Crowder. In this interview, the answers from Mrs. Thigpen and Crowder are central to this presentation. Collectively, Mrs. Thigpen and Crowder have over 35 years of experience within schools. Mrs. Crowder earned her undergraduate education from Capital University as an intervention specialist. She also went to graduate school at the University of Dayton to become a school counselor. She has 13 years of experience as a special education teacher in both elementary and middle school, as well as 7 years of experience as a high school counselor, all in Columbus City schools. Mrs. Thigpen, on the other hand, has a bachelor's of psychology and a bachelor's in school counseling, as well as a minor in education. Mrs. Thigpen also received an educational doctorate in K-12 educational leadership. In fact, her doctorate dissertation helped to inform the questions that make up the survey. I would highly encourage you to check the resources to review her doctorate dissertation. Ultimately, Mrs. Thigpen used her education in her career as a counselor of 15 years in the Columbus City Schools District. I would like to take a moment to directly thank Mrs. Thigpen and Mrs. Crowder for all they have done to help me in speaking to you today. Beyond responding to my survey, they have both done much as my counselors to make me into the man I am today, and for that, I am grateful. I hope in me sharing parts of their responses you can see just how much education means to these two wonderful people. So, with all that being said, please come along with me, just for a few moments, to think about our system of education here in the U.S. It is, after all, just one way that we give to those generations of children that will outlive us. To begin my survey, I asked 3 questions and recorded the responses of Mrs. Thigpen and Crowder. These questions were heavily informed and shaped by resources from the original questionnaire document linked in the description. You can also review all citations in the read-along script. My first question was, how do we address racial and ethnic inequality in the classroom without being biased towards one student or another? What can we do to combat bias within our own classroom? This question was informed by the idea that we cannot talk about SES and poverty in America without addressing its relationship with race, ethnicity, and immigration status. See Kang 2022. We also know that teachers can often subconsciously show bias towards students based on their SES. See Bloem 2024. The responses for this question largely talked about building deep interpersonal relationships with students, as well as recognizing bias, even subconscious, both inside and outside the classroom. Mrs. Crowder specifically talked about how, quote, when students feel that we genuinely care, it creates an environment where trust can grow. And, quote, developing these relationships with students takes time and consistency is key. Teaching with dignity and respect is foundational. She also mentioned a book that was especially useful to her as a teacher, Teaching with Love and Logic by Jim Funk and David Fay. Mrs. Thigpen also relayed these sentiments, as well as expanding on what it actually means to recognize bias as an educator. She highlighted how, quote, it begins internally. It may take hard truths to understand where these biases were created and what must be done to undo them. Each student deserves the respect of teachers and staff, unquote, and by overcoming our own bias and giving students the respect they deserve, we set an example for how they should treat each other. I wholeheartedly agree with both Mrs. Crowder and Thigpen. It is vital to our work as educators that every student feels that they are being treated fairly. And I think it is also important to recognize just how harmful our underlying expectations can be to students. In Chapter 38 of the Model Minority Myth by Yin Luang, we learn just how much our expectations about people in general can affect their entire lives. As Luang points out, the pervasiveness of racial stereotypes like the model minority myth follow people into their careers and jobs. In the case of Asian Americans, this can often mean that they will be less likely to receive promotions in relatively, quote, safe professions, even if they are good workers. I believe that these stereotypes often start and flourish within schools and similar institutions. It is paramount that we as teachers do not contribute to these biases and work to build an environment of love, respect, and caring within our classrooms. My second question was, what can we do as educators to ensure that every student who enters the classroom has the opportunity to succeed even when there are pressures outside of the classroom? What can we do to limit factors such as school mobility and return autonomy and control to the student? How much should we demand of our students, considering how much their life outside of school might affect them? This question was informed by the fact that many low SES students may experience things like school mobility, which can result in less close relationships with teachers. See McKinnon, 2018. Other factors, such as student autonomy, educational control, and ownership of one's academics, can also play a large role in a student's educational experience. See Thigpen, 2024. Mrs. Thigpen and Crowder again pointed out the importance of building strong relationships with our students. Even in the short time that we have with them, Mrs. Thigpen in particular talked about how, quote, in speaking with students, so many of them stressed the impact of having at least one teacher personally invested in them and their success. It motivated them to work harder to make that individual proud. Surprisingly, they also took accountability for their own success, stating that they were fully in charge of their academic success, noting that they regretted not making better decisions throughout their academic careers, unquote. She also pointed out that in cases where students experience school mobility or any other litany of things outside of the school, that, quote, through the focus of relationship building in the classroom, educators can aid students in rebuilding their academic autonomy. Additionally, in my talks with students, they valued teachers with high expectations. Even when barriers exist, students want to be pushed to achieve, unquote. Mrs. Crowder responded by sharing that, quote, connections allow educators to identify and address all types of barriers, from basic needs like food insecurity to social emotional challenges. When students trust their teachers, they are more willing to share their struggles, which helps educators connect them to necessary resources, unquote. She also shared how having just one teacher who really cares can help a student immensely. Both Mrs. Crowder and Mrs. Thigpen highlighted how external factors like school mobility can also affect students' ability or students because of the differences between schools and schools districts. When students experience these differences, they feel like they are losing their autonomy and control over their own education. I personally think it is important to understand as educators just how much education is shaped by the world around it. When we are working with children, we must see the whole person. Students bring ideas, beliefs, values, and experiences from outside of the school into the school with them every day. Furthermore, as Richard Rothstein pointed out in his 2004 Intro to Class in Schools, when talking about class, we must remember that lower class families are characterized by, quote, a collection of occupational, psychological, personality, health, and economic traits that interact, predicting performance not only in schools, but in other institutions as well. On average, this differs from the performance of families from higher social classes, unquote. And so when we discuss these differences that shape our classroom, and we understand that they are driven by class, SES, and poverty, we must also understand that their effects transcend the classroom. And so for those short periods of time where we have the chance to change our students' lives, we must act. We must broaden what a fair and equitable education means to include things like health, nutrition, technology, income, and further. And we must do everything we can, provide every resource we have, spend every dollar we can, ensuring that our students receive a fair education by all these metrics. This leads well into what the third and final question was that I asked. This is something that is discussed throughout nearly every piece of literature I've gathered. That is, what are the broader overarching policies related to SES and racial and ethnic inequities in America that need to be addressed for every student to be successful in the classroom? This question was particularly informed by discussions around the role of health and nutrition access in education, as well as teachers' attitudes towards different students. See Good 2024 and George's 2009. Mrs. Thigpen discussed school funding. She talked about how while urban schools may spend more per student, there is still inequity because the majority of students in our building, for example, do not have access to computers and are reliant on the district to provide the technology. However, the district is not able to provide one-to-one devices for all students, unquote. She also talked about the maintenance of school facilities not being up to standard depending on the school district's income. One example she gave was in the operation, or lack thereof, of HVAC systems. Mrs. Crowder talked about how school disciplinary actions are often unfair and disproportionately impact Black and Latino students, as well as students with disabilities. She specifically pushed for schools to reconsider, quote, zero tolerance policies, which frequently push these students out of the educational system and into the criminal justice system, unquote. She highlighted how, quote, it is crucial to implement restorative justice with fidelity instead of utilizing a punitive model, unquote. Again, I find both Mrs. Crowder and Mrs. Thigpen's responses to be enlightening. I agree that we must do more, not only as educators, but as a society, to provide all children the access to those tools that they need to succeed, whether that's technology or any other necessity like food or hygiene products. I think we must push for this both in and outside of schools. I also think that the conversation around school discipline is very important, and I would like to close us out with something similar. Throughout this presentation, you may have asked yourself, if I know a student is or is likely experiencing challenges and difficulties as a result of poverty and racial or ethnic inequality, why don't I change the way I teach them? Why don't I change the way I grade them? And I think this is a very reasonable question to ask. And what I'm here to tell you, as a student who has experienced extreme poverty and who comes from a community heavily impacted by historic racial inequality, is that we owe it to our students to allow them to control their own outcomes. For a student to walk away from the classroom feeling that sense of accomplishment and pride education should bring, they must have the autonomy and control to change it. Close your eyes and imagine for a moment that within every classroom in America, we grade students based on their ability to contribute to one large collection of paintings. When they come into the school, however, we realize that some students have broken brushes, spilled paints, and torn canvases. It is our job as educators, as parents, as human beings, to ensure that each student has the same access to the paints and brushes they need to complete their artwork. But when we go to fix their canvases, rather than making them smaller and restricting just how much they can contribute in an attempt to make it safer or easier for them, we should make sure they have the same size. Why? Because when these students unleash their creativity and they tell their story, they should have the same opportunity to do so as every other student. And when we go to judge their work, we should understand that every effort is infinitely valuable, that every story is different and beautiful, and that every student matters. Thank you. Have a great day.